Thanks for joining me on the Global News on Zuma Nigeria. I'm Lois Tureki. Ukraine, 8 killed in Russian shelling. Pope Francis visits Hungary today. China warns over Taiwan as U.S. Philippines boost ties. Sri Lanka, Apex Bank reveals level of economic woes. And United Nations demands ban reversal on women's rights. On Russia-Ukraine war, Russian airstrikes have hit cities across Ukraine, including the capital, Kyiv, killing at least 8 people. According to the local mayor, a woman and her 3-year-old daughter were killed in the city of Dnipro. According to officials, 4 people died and 17 others were wounded in the central city of Uman after missiles hit residential buildings. There were also explosions in the cities of Kremenchuk and Poltava, according to reports. The head of the Kyiv City Military Administration said this was the first Russian missile attack on the capital in 51 days. There are no immediate reports of civilian casualties in the capital. According to report from officials, 21 out of 23 missiles and 2 attack drones were shot down by Ukraine's air defense system. A video posted on social media by Ukraine's State Border Service showed a badly destroyed apartment building in Uman after the strikes. The attacks come as Ukrainian forces are thought to be getting ready for a military offensive with latest equipment, including tanks supplied by Western allies. Russia has tried to make headway in a winter offensive, including a 10-month battle for control of the strategically important city of Bakhmut. On Friday, Pope Francis arrives in Hungary for a 3-day pastoral visit, his first full journey to the country since he became Pope 10 years ago. What kept him away was the tough anti-migrant stance of Prime Minister Viktor Orban, in contrast to the 86-year-old pontiff's compassion for all asylum seekers. Aside his support for Catholics, the war in Ukraine is another reason he is in the country. Ukraine and Hungary share a 134 kilometers, 85-mile border. But unlike other EU leaders, Mr. Orban has refused to back military assistance for Kyiv and maintained ties with Russia's Vladimir Putin. The Pope said ahead of his visit it will also be a journey to the center of the Europe, over which the icy winds of war continue to blow. The Argentine Pope has been to Eastern Europe before, in 2019 to Romania and 2021 to Slovakia. On his way to Slovakia, he stopped for many hours to celebrate Mass in Budapest, the closing event of the International Eucharistic Congress. The pontiff vowed to return, and careful Hungarian diplomacy in Rome led to his visit, which is being portrayed by pro-government media as a diplomatic triumph for the Orban government, even a chance to end its international isolation over the war in Ukraine. This is the Pope's first foreign visit since he was treated in hospital at the end of March for bronchitis. Ahead of the visit, he met Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal, who invited him to visit Kyiv. Pope Francis will meet Mr. Orban and Hungarian President Katalin Novak on Friday, the architect of the country's efforts to encourage couples to have more children. This includes generous loans and payouts to married couples who vow to have children. The strategies have had some success but faltered during the pandemic. On Saturday, the Pope will meet poor and homeless people and refugees from Ukraine, Afghanistan, Sudan, Iraq, Iran, and Pakistan. They include Abbas Soltani, an Iranian convert to Christianity who spent 18 months in detention in a Hungarian transit zone. The Hungarian government has a special office to support persecuted Christians around the world. Now, battle between 2 Pacific superpowers, the Philippines has long had to tread carefully when it comes to dealing with Beijing and Washington's opposing interests, a complex juggling act that has been on vivid display in recent weeks. April has been a mostly busy month for Philippine diplomacy, with the country hosting its biggest joint military maneuvers yet with the United States, while also receiving a top envoy from China, which has grown progressively anxious and outspoken about the archipelago's defense relations. Only a few years ago, U.S.-Philippine ties were in a vulnerable place. Rodrigo Duterte, the country's then leader, routinely launched obscenity-laden rants against U.S. counterpart Barack Obama while downplaying long-standing territorial clashes with Beijing and seeking to attract investment from its giant neighbor to the north. But the election of his successor, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., last year has returned relations to a more even keel, in part because Manila has become cautious of a more assertive China. Marcos Jr., who has been on a charm offensive to restore relations with Manila's historical ally, is set to fly to the United States to meet with President Joe Biden in Washington next week. His visit caps a month of frenetic exchanges with the United States. Over 12,000 American forces joined some 5,000 soldiers from the Philippines over the last 3 weeks to take part in the largest Balikatan joint military drills to date, an event Beijing's state-run media has labeled an attempt to target China. The climax of the war games came Wednesday when U.S. and Philippine forces fired on a mock enemy warship in the West Philippine Sea, the part of the South China Sea that encompasses the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. Just as those drills kicked off, the U.S. also hosted 2 top diplomats from the Philippines for talks during which both sides agreed to finish a roadmap for the U.S. to provide security aid to its regional ally the next 5 to 10 years, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said in a 2+2 meeting in Washington. In its annual report, Sri Lanka's central bank has laid out the extent of the country's worst economic problems in over 70 years. The bank outlined how last year wages failed to keep up with the rising cost of everything from food to fuel. Several inherent weaknesses and policy lapses helped to stoke the extreme economic woes that consumed the South Asian nation, the bank says. The bank now anticipates the economy to return to growth next year. The Central Bank of Sri Lanka forecasts the economy will decline by 2% this year, but expand by 3.3% in 2024. The prediction is more optimistic than the International Monetary Fund (IMF), which forecasts a contraction in 2023 of around 3% and a growth of 1.5% next year. The central bank's report also detailed how deadline inflation reached almost 70% in September as prices of fresh fruits, wheat and eggs more than doubled. At the same time, the cost of transportation and essential utilities such as electricity and water rose even faster. The economy shrank by 7.8% last year, and the country failed to pay on its foreign debt for the first time since independence from the UK in 1948. Defaults happen when governments are able to meet some or all their debt payments to creditors. This destroys its reputation, with lenders making it even difficult to borrow money on the international markets. An unsustainable economic model steered the country towards a multifaceted disaster, it added. Sri Lanka owes almost $7 billion, 5.7 euro to China, and about $1 billion to India. In February, both countries agreed to restructure their loans, giving Sri Lanka more time to pay them back. Last month, the IMF agreed to lend Sri Lanka $3 billion that was on top of the $600 million loan from the World Bank last year. Sri Lanka's government is presently discussing its debt repayments with bondholders and creditors before the IMF reviews the situation in September. On women's rights, the United Nations Security Council (UNSC) has solidly condemned a ban by the Taliban on Afghan women working for the United Nations in Afghanistan, calling on Taliban leaders to swiftly reverse a crackdown on the rights of women and girls. The resolution outlined by the United Arab Emirates and Japan describes the ban as unprecedented in the history of the United Nations and says it undermines human rights and humanitarian principles. The resolution also stresses the indispensable role of women in Afghan society. Lana Nusaybe, UAE's ambassador to the UN, said over 90 countries co-sponsored the resolution from Afghanistan's immediate neighborhood, from the Muslim world, and from all corners of the earth. This support makes our fundamental message today even more important. The war will not sit by silently as women in Afghanistan are erased from society, she told the UNSC. The UNSC vote came days before a planned international meeting concerning Afghanistan in Doha on May 1st and 2nd. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres will convene behind closed doors the special envoys on Afghanistan from several countries to work on a joint approach to deal with the Taliban. We will not stand for the Taliban's repression of women and girls, the United States Deputy Ambassador to the UN, Robert Wood, told the UNSC. These decisions are indefensible. They are not seen anywhere else in the world. The Taliban edicts are causing irreparable damage to Afghanistan. The Taliban earlier this month started imposing the ban on Afghan women working for the United Nations after stopping most women working for the humanitarian aid groups in December. Since toppling the Western Bar government in 2021, the group has also tightened controls on women's access to public life, including barring women from universities and closing girls' high schools. The Taliban says it respects women's rights in accordance with its stringent interpretation of Islamic law and that decisions on female help workers were an internal issue. The Security Council resolution also recognizes the need to tackle considerable challenges facing Afghanistan's economy, including through using assets belonging to the Afghanistan Central Bank for the benefits of the Afghan people. On more stories, several support PM's judicial reform. Numerous right-wing Israelis have taken to the streets of Jerusalem to show their support for controversial legislation by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government, which will see the country's apex court stripped of its much power. Israelis remain polarized over the planned legislation that the government says is essential to rein in a judiciary that wields too much power, but that critics say remove as a critical check on those in power. Multitudes of people, several carrying Israel's blue and white national flag, which has also been used as a symbol of the protest against the said legislation, could be seen outside Israel's parliament. Some strapped on a carpet displaying the faces of Israel's Supreme Court President and ex-Attorney General. Many supporters were wearing pins and holding flags supporting far-right Israeli political parties. The nation demands judicial reform, the crowds chanted. Netanyahu last month postponed the overhaul after 16 weeks of mass anti-government protests increase, bringing Jerusalem and Tel Aviv to a standstill and threatening to paralyze the economy. Thursday's protest marked a rare show of public support for the plan. The plan will give Netanyahu, who is on trial on corruption charges, and his far-right and ultra-Orthodox coalition partners the final say in appointing the nation's judges. It will also give Parliament, which is controlled by his allies, authority to overturn Supreme Court decisions and limit the court's ability to review laws. Opponents say the plan is a power grab that will abate Israel's democracy and its system of checks and balances, focusing authority in the hands of the Prime Minister and his hardline allies. The protests have drawn support from secular and liberal Israelis, pilots and officers in elite military reserve units, high-tech business leaders, and former officials. They also say Netanyahu has a conflict of interest in trying to reform the nation's legal system at a time when he is on trial. In Africa, talking Sudan war, truce extended but crisis ongoing. Opposing factions of Sudan's military have agreed to renew a 3-day ceasefire shortly before it was due to expire. The extension for another 72 hours follows thorough diplomatic efforts by neighboring countries as well as the US, UK and the United Nations, but there are ongoing reports of heavy fighting in the capital, Khartoum. The earlier truce permitted thousands of people to try to flee to safety, while dozens of countries have tried to evacuate their citizens. Nearly 2 weeks of fighting between the army and a rival paramilitary group have left hundreds dead. The ceasefire had been anticipated to end at midtime local time, 22 hours GMT. Early on Thursday evening, the Sudanese Regular Army agreed to an extension, and its rival, the Paramilitary Rapid Support Forces RSF, followed suit hours later. South Sudan has offered to host peace talks, and the army has agreed to send representatives to the deliberation. Antony Blinken, U.S. Secretary of State, said Washington was very actively working to extend the ceasefire, adding that while imperfect, it had reduced violence. But White House spokeswoman Karine Jean-Pierre later said the situation could deteriorate at any moment. Meanwhile, the RSF and eyewitnesses said the army had been pounding its oppositions in Khartoum. The foreign minister in the civilian government, Mariam Al-Sadiq Al-Mahdi, said that despite the ceasefire, civilians were still living in fear. Fighting has also been reported in the Western Darfur region and other provinces. No less than 512 people have been killed in the fighting and closely 4,200 injured, although the real number of deaths could be much more higher. The World Health Organization said it anticipated there to be many more deaths due to outbreaks of disease and a lack of services. Health officials say most hospitals in conflict areas are not functioning, and over 60% of health facilities in Khartoum are inactive. David Miliband, the head of the International Rescue Committee and former British Foreign Secretary, said the international community was in danger of neglecting the wider crisis in Sudan in the rush to evacuate foreign nationals. Let's take a break. When I come back, I bring you news from Nigeria. You're welcome back. News from Nigeria. Federal government suspends subsidy removal. On Thursday, the National Economic Council in Abuja asked the federal government to put the June deadline for petroleum subsidy removal on hold pending the review of existing plans to provide palliatives for Nigerians. While arguing that the petrol subsidy should not be removed now, the council said the federal government will broaden consultations with state governments and other major stakeholders such as labor unions, petroleum marketers, the Ministry of Finance, Nigerian Upstream Petroleum Regulatory Commission, and representatives of incoming administration. This expanded committee will determine if the removal can be done by June as planned, it said. Zainab Ahmed, the Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, disclosed this to State House correspondents shortly after the valedictory NEC meeting presided over by Vice President Yemi Osinbajo at the council chambers of the presidential villa in Abuja. She said there might be a need to send a supplementary budget to the National Assembly if the incoming administration aligned with the decision to extend subsidy removal. According to Ahmed, the council has, however, agreed that the subsidy must be removed now rather than later, as the nation cannot afford it anymore. She noted that the 2023 budget provides for subsidy only up to June 2023. More so, the provisions of the Petroleum Industry Act require the deregulation of several sectors 18 months after the effective date of the subsidy removal. Therefore, she said the federal government had agreed to form an expanded committee to consider the removal process. This includes determining the precise time and the measures to be taken to support the poor and vulnerable and ensure a sufficient supply of petroleum products nationwide. The minister noted that the nation will now be operating two laws in the oil sector. However, the incoming administration will have to amend both the Appropriation Act and the PIA to bring them at par with current realities based on their decisions on the fuel subsidy, she explained. At least 5,500 Nigerians expectant from Sudan today. Around 5,500 Nigerian students in Sudan will be evacuated due to the violence in the North African country, an official has said. The chairperson of Nigerians in Diaspora Commission, Abike Dabiri Erewa, said this Thursday at the weekly ministerial briefing organized by the Presidential Communications team. She said there are more than 3 million Nigerians residing in Sudan and efforts are being made to evacuate as many of them as possible if the war persists. However, priority will be given to children, students and women, she said. Mrs. Dabiri Erewa said already 13 buses carrying Nigerians have departed Sudan for the Egyptian border of Aswan, from where the returnees will be airlifted back to the country. The first batch are anticipated in Nigeria today, Friday, her spokesperson quoted her as saying at the briefing. According to reports, the Nigerian government earlier announced that it had loaned 40 buses for the evacuation. The buses cost $1.2 million, an official announced on Wednesday. All in all, 13 buses have departed for Aswan border in Egypt, where they will be received by the Nigerian ambassador there and the Director General of the National Emergency Management Agency, NEMA, Habib Ahmed, who is already there with some officials. She expressed the fears that the buses conveying the Nigerians will be attacked by either of the two factions fighting in Sudan, saying the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Geoffrey Oyema, already secured the understanding of the leaders of the factions before the transportation of Nigerians by road. Fighting erupted on 15th April between the Sudanese army and paramilitary RSF, both headed by army generals. Over 400 people have been killed in the violence, and many countries, including the US and Saudi Arabia, have commenced the evacuation of their citizens. Mrs. Dabiri Erewa said as the evacuees return to Nigeria, they will be given stipends to aid them settle down before joining their families. And finally, on the news, 9 new petitions filed against KANU by federal government. Yesterday, the federal government got permission from the Apex Court to file 9 fresh grounds of appeal to oppose the release of the leader of the indigenous people of Biafra, IPOB, Mazi Nnamdi Kanu, from detention. The Supreme Court granted FG's request to include the fresh grounds in its amended notice of appeal dated October 28, 2022. The ruling followed an application moved by a government lawyer, Mr. Tijani Ghazali, son, who equally sought an adjournment to respond to Kanu's request to be transferred from the detention facility of the Department of State Services DSS to the Kuje Correctional Center. Ghazali told the court that he will need time to file a counter-affidavit to oppose Kanu's request. Thus, a 5-member panel of the Supreme Court led by the Justice Inya Okoro adjourned the case till May 11th for a definite hearing. It will be recalled that the Court of Appeal in Abuja had, in a judgment on October 13, 2022, ordered Kanu's release from detention in a unanimous decision by a 3-member panel. The appellate court also squashed a 15-count terrorism charge that the federal government entered against Kanu before the Federal High Court in Abuja. The court said it was satisfied with the federal government blatantly violating all known laws when it forcefully rendered Kanu from Kenya to the country for the continuation of his trial. It held that such arbitrary use of power by the Nigerian government stripped the trial court of the jurisdiction to continue the Kanu's trial. However, dissatisfied with the judgment, the federal government took the matter before the Supreme Court and urged the appellate court to suspend the execution of the judgment pending the determination of its appeal. Thanks for watching. That's all on the news. Enjoy the rest of your day and have a great weekend ahead.